Yeah, so the best part about the last talk was it just totally set the stage for the kind of things that I think are incredibly important, but I'm going to sort of come up a few levels of abstraction and talk a bit more about the systems of people that are enabled by these infrastructural technologies. So the Web3 is essentially a new social and economic infrastructure that we're building using software, peer-to-peer networks, a variety of tools that are available to us that are brand new. And so the shape of our space that we live in is changing. In general, this isn't new at all. Actually, we've always sort of co-evolved our social and economic systems with our technological and physical systems. So when we learn to build sort of certain types of bridges and roads, when we learn to build skyscrapers, but when we learn to build pretty much anything, we sort of adapted our patterns of interacting with each other. We adapted our patterns of interacting with those things. And in general, this is not a new pattern at all. And we want to stop and think about it and sort of ask ourselves what social and economic systems are emerging from our new infrastructure. And actually, infrastructure is the key word here, because infrastructure is actually very different from products. And we heard a lot about the infrastructure that we're building and how it needs to be easier, and we need to understand better what it implies for us. But the thing that makes infrastructure so different from, say, a product is that infrastructure is successful when it's invisible, when it's not hard, when you go about your daily life and you do the thing that you do, and what's enabled for you is not something where you go out of your way. You drive to the store, you use the roads, you turn on your light and the power grid supports you, you sign on to the internet, and now we say, well, you know, we have this sort of old style, centralized, we'll say, infrastructure that's maybe not being treated like a public good. It might be being used sort of for reasons or in ways that we might not prefer. And if we want our internet infrastructure to be a public good, then we're sort of taking ownership of it. And in a sense, that's actually part of this adaptation cycle. And so I really like this slide. I use it at the beginning of a lot of my talks because this is a complex adaptive system where we're part of the system. We actually can't set ourselves apart from it and say, oh yeah, like here's the thing that I made. We actually have to reason about our own participation in that system. And I like this Hayek quote because Hayek is a favorite economist of the community, and he even points out that economics is there to help us understand the limitations of what we can do. But that's not to say that we can't do things. It's actually more to say that because we're part of it, because these feedback loops are present, we actually need to reason about it differently. We're not just making something, we're adapting something that we're part of. So I'm going to zoom out for a moment and just talk about networks in the really general sense. Networks are nodes and edges. Whether they're peer-to-peer networks, whether they're economic networks, flows of funds, whether they're social networks, people engaging with each other. A network is about links and nodes. And in the social and economic systems, we're the links and nodes. And so as we sort of go forward in terms of the age of networks, we're not necessarily talking about the age of peer-to-peer file sharing networks, or even the age of sort of, platform applications that allow us to have peer-to-peer economic networks. We're actually still just talking about people and these other technologies that allow us to coordinate. And to coordinate in a decentralized way, because the rules through which we interact with each other, our form edges in these social and economic graphs, are determined less by a third party and more by us. So any particular edge in a social and economic graph can be, well, I have some things that I want or need, and you have some things that you want or need, and it shouldn't really matter what the dimension of value is here. It shouldn't need to be reduced to a financial transaction. It should merely be that there's an overlap here in what we can do together, make an exchange, a transaction, if you will, but there's a difference between the transactions that happen and the feasible sets of transactions, and our infrastructure often defines what we can do with each other. And when we have sort of centralized organizations defining what we can do together, we have some limitations that maybe we don't need to have if our systems are enabled in a more decentralized way. So trying to think about these social and economic systems as being comprised of humans and infrastructure that allows us to interact with each other, giving us sort of can-dos. So in particular, though, we're not very simple, right? We have really complex mix of traits. And so here I was sort of playing around with myself as a node in a multi-scale network of networks. I'm kind of individually, I have a value system that wants to have impact on science and engineering. I'm a researcher who wishes to enable other people, support the creation of new infrastructure. Obviously, I have my family. It relates to my physical and emotional connections. I have a firm that I run. It's more than 10 people full-time, so it's a lot of work both socially and economically. I participate in a variety of different technological systems. Obviously, I have my economic world. I spend money to receive goods and services. I have a professional community, actually several professional communities, of which I participate with often my most constrained resource, which is attention, and I sort of put it in and I get some back, and maybe we build better things because of it. I also participate in sort of a government or society. I'm a citizen of the United States by birth, essentially. It's a jurisdiction that I didn't really choose, but of which I am a part, and I have both commitments and sort of responsibilities, and I get rights and privileges because of it. And more broadly, I'm a member of this sort of large sort of cyber physical system, which I'll define later, which is the whole world. And that world has issues in its own right, and I'm sort of interested in ways that we can use our understanding of systems to change it for the better. So my talk is actually about cybernetics, which you may or may not have heard of. I'm going to use this sort of limited definition where we talk about the domain of social science and economics and the methods from complexity science and systems engineering. It's more than that, but I'm not going to try to explain this whole diagram or the several transdisciplinary definitions that exist. But what really matters is that this is sort of a formal science of steering systems, and not necessarily in the sense of centralized control, but in the sense of systems that have their own objectives, wants, needs, and they're sort of co-steering each other. It's a sort of critical, sort of semi-formal field that's used to understand the way systems interact with each other. Came about in the 40s, and actually I'll jump to this slide. Brief history from way back till recently. You have cybernetics is actually coined with respect to Plato's reference about the study of self-governance in one of his texts. The word cybernetic was first used by Ampere to refer to the study of the science of government, and in fact its contemporary definition is related to the early control systems and economic network theory that was being applied to everything from evolutionary biology to other social and economic regulatory systems. The book that kind of defined the term was by Norbert Wiener in 1948. But the idea here is that we're talking about complex adaptive systems that evolve, and you can even find in a variety of rather old references discussions of things like price discovery made analogous to Darwinian evolution. And this is this sort of complex adaptive process that we talk about all the time. And I want to make sure that we don't miss out on what people have learned or discovered or researched about these processes as they pertain to social and economic systems in the past. So we've had some successes and some failures. It's an inherently imperfect science, but we've had things like the limits to growth, which was the research of the sort of system dynamics community, which used sort of differential equations to represent sustainability challenges, and like looked at the way that we could extrapolate the sort of challenges that we're experiencing today in the environmental setting. We've had sort of, we'll call them trials or experiments in governments. In CyberSyn is relatively well known. You can sort of read about it, but it was an attempt to put a sort of centralized command center to help manage the economy in Chile. There are other sort of computer designed systems that were maybe overreaches in the Soviet Union yeah, okay, so there are overreaches in a lot of ways. In fact, the big challenge is that they were inherently centralized. And so the theory itself is really, really good at managing the idea of decentralization, but in fact, we didn't have the technologies to use the theory well. And so most of my enthusiasm about cybernetics comes from the fact that we can actually use it to design decentralized systems, or at least make inferences about how a decentralized system might adapt, and more importantly, make inferences about how we impact adapting them, which brings me to second order cybernetics, which was popular in the 70s and 80s. capabilities. And it was sort of this recognition that, wait, we're like not just steering this system, like we are part of it. Our participation, our discussion, our steering is part of that system. And so one of the quote terms associated with second order cybernetics is taking circularity seriously. It's very hard to reason about systems with feedback loops, whether they're spatial in the sense that we have a network of interacting agents, or temporal in the sense that my actions are actually going to influence future state, and that state influences incentives or future actions. And actually one of the most important steps to taking seriously questions of ethics, autonomy, self-consistency, and other aspects of self-organizing complex systems is to really understand that we can't put the system over here, step over here, and go, there's the system, I'm making it work. Until we actually have the tools, the methods, and the science to reason about how it will behave with ourselves inside of it, we're always going to sort of run into clashes. We're going to get unintended consequences. And we kind of want to work beyond that. Fortunately, we actually have a modern progression here to cyber physical systems. And during my introduction, Lane talked about the fact that I've sort of worked with larger scale systems. I've done some research and design for dynamic resource allocation problems and sort of resource protection schemes for cyber physical systems. And in particular, I really like it if people look at this diagram, because this is a concept map for a field that contains like all the stuff that we care about in Web3. We've got humans in the loop, we've got networked and or distributed, we've got adaptive and predictive, we've got intelligent, all up in the sort of right hand, the upper middle, I guess. And this relates to the humans in the loop and the networks and that feedback process that makes it so hard. We have cybersecurity issues that we have to contend with. We have sort of a scale that makes us have to think about things like modeling in a way that handles complexity, abstraction hierarchies, and tools that help us put all of these pieces together. Juan showed us all of the incredible pieces of the Web3 infrastructure that are being built, and now we have to like put them to work to actually build a human infrastructure, like something that helps us be better. And some of that is actually going to come from helping us better understand how to put these things together. And that often in infrastructure scale systems involves modeling, like we discussed. It involves tools to improve modeling, but it also includes, in the case of these truly decentralized systems, feedback loops actually between the design and modeling tools and the decision makers who are us. And it's really hard to do a good job at systems of this level of complexity without being well informed and without tools that help us be well informed. So the very tools that we would use to design and implement centralized or arguably pseudo-centralized infrastructure can be used to help us inform our participants in our decentralized systems. And to the discussions in the panel earlier, I'm a strong proponent of actually starting small and learning how to build DAOs as social and economic infrastructure and sort of letting them grow and scale as we understand them better. But we still want to start with the approach or the knowledge from building large-scale systems. So I like to use the power grid as an example of a sort of safety critical system, because our economic and social systems essentially become safety critical when we think about the amounts of money and people's sort of financial well-being tied up in them, or even as they become a larger and larger component of our lives, they could be safety critical in the sense that if they go down, someone might miss out on sort of shelter, support, medical care, etc. So we do want to reason about them like decentralized infrastructure, safety critical systems. And so these kinds of systems, they have sort of protections that help them avoid what I would say is breaking out of their own models. So all models are wrong, they're useful to some end, we design things using these models, and when we want things to be safety critical, things are safety critical, we need to make sure that we actually can catch the system before it moves out of its own support. So if it starts to move in a direction that would violate the assumptions that went into the design, then it actually changes modes through some sequence of contingencies. And this doesn't even require necessarily escalation to humans. It could. If it did, that could be a decentralized process. But even in the automated systems, you can sort of escalate as something sort of approaches the known boundaries of those system models. There have been some pretty significant advances in applied mathematics related to coordination in the last 20 years. A lot of the game theory has made its way into this community. There's also multi-agent dynamic controls problems that share a lot of the same mathematics. There's a really important subset of this that is very goal-driven, resistant to failures and attacks precisely because the system's not derived from mechanisms that are first order, hey, I want you to do this. They're not instructions. Rather, they're, here's the goals, and the system responds to the goals in a way that attempts to, say, to descend a penalty function, or won't go into mathy things, but it's actually the same concepts that we use to model human behavior and other rational actors, with the odd caveat that we don't actually know what the human actors' incentives are, and we probably don't want to impose any on them. So after having said all that, I will say that, so these blockchain-enabled economic systems are complex systems, and actually I'll go beyond blockchain-enabled and just say our general sort of cryptographic network-enabled economic systems, though this slide is for using Bitcoin as an example, so you can pardon my over-specification. We're talking about systems, we're talking about complex systems, which are ones where the behavior of the system is sort of greater than the sum of its parts, social systems which involve us, economic systems, which are sort of a subset of social systems, and then we get into these properties that are pretty formal: dynamic, networked, adaptive, multi-scale, stochastic. These are all terms that we can use to understand formally the behavior of systems on a network, even when we don't know exactly what's going to happen. So we don't really know what people are going to do. We know what they can do. Maybe we have some estimates about what they might want to do. And so the sort of fields that are emerging from this, and the ones that I'm participating in, are sort of the study of economic systems as systems, using systems theory, systems of systems, understanding how to compose these things so that they're good for us as people, not just building the technologies, building the roads and bridges or the power grids, but actually taking it up to the level of how do we make sure that what we're building is right for us. And so economic systems engineering is the term I use for sort of designing and evaluating and modeling and governing these systems, like managing their life cycles and helping them be good infrastructure. Token economics and token engineering I actually use more for stepping into the part. The economic system as a whole contains much, much more than the cryptographic networks and the tokens or the proofs of state that we have, but it includes the ability to specifically engineer those parts. And so if we have simple sort of things that are just representations of an asset or a proof of a right, it's relatively simple. But when we actually bring in the question of purpose-driven tokens, or we bring in steering systems, which is inherently what cybernetics is, it's steering systems, we're talking about automation engineering. And so we're building automated infrastructure that is social and economic. And we're closing this loop on our economic systems with our technologies, and that kind of brings us back to the first slide. And we need to be purposeful about this. We need to understand, what it is that we hope to accomplish, and actually better understand how the systems we make might behave so that we can govern them, right? Because one of the biggest challenges with these systems is that you can't have good quality participation by the governed without informing the participants. And so we can't have an arbitrarily high attention cost for participating. And one of the points I'd like to make here is that the stuff that I'm talking about is not like science fiction. Actually, this is from a paper in the Systems Man and Cybernetics conference in the IEEE. It's been around for decades. But in a recent, I think this is 2007, there's sort of an update to talk about sort of how the sort of roles of these adaptive oriented systems relate with human decision making, relate to whole systems. And what you'll see here is infrastructure and transportation, environmental and energy systems, aerospace and defense. It turns out, though, that this growing channel of service systems, which is the term that was used in that field, is actually closer related to a lot of the stuff we're doing. We're like literally just providing services to each other. We're decentralizing this sort of, hey, I'm going to store some files and I'm going to do some computation for you and we're going to send you some money. And we don't necessarily have a service system infrastructure today, but we're building one. And so I think that's pretty important. One of the most important things for me is that we're kind of breaking this trade-off curve. I won't go into too much detail, but basically in the past with economic and social decision-making, we've been sort of stuck in fuzzy territory because the highly technical systematic methods for making decisions are really hard to apply. And so in a scenario where there's not as much benefit, or it might be hard to justify the benefit, we make decisions based on epistemologically weak methods or epistemologically weak thinking. And when we start automating these systems now, we have this sort of an observability and controllability of our base level transactions with each other. We actually get the benefit of this blue arrow, and we can push some of these methods that are much stronger higher up into the domain of applicability because we can embed them and abstract them away from the end users. So you can get the benefit of these sort of higher validity methods without actually having to even understand that they're there. In an example of markets, this would be like saying, well, a market is an estimator that's attempting to discover the price of something, but it's really an emergent estimator. If you have things like a bonding curve embedded into an interface or as an adapter between two economic systems, and you design that curve properly, you can actually turn it into a better estimator. And in fact, you could argue that like Uniswap in the Ethereum ecosystem is similar in that the liquidity pool, because of its statefulness, can serve as a stronger estimator of the price than the market would without it. So I'm going to sort of lean towards wrapping up since I'm just about out of time here. But what I'm really talking about here with purpose-driven systems is that the way that we steer systems is not by telling them what to do, but by establishing goals and embedding epistemologically strong, which just means like strong scientifically, automated methods. So the methods discover things, they don't do things. They help us be better versions of us rather than make us do things. And this is really important because anytime we embed an objective function inside of a system that we've designed, we have made a subjective choice. There is no global right objective for any of these systems. There's many. We have our individual objectives. They're not totally or perfectly consistent with each other, and yet we still have networks, social and economic networks comprised of us, and we have goals at our individual level, we have goals at a communal level, and those things might be in tension, but our steering systems, as it were, they sort of help guide us or coordinate us towards our shared goals, even when they're in tension with our individual goals. And as a whole, even those systems co-steer each other. And so we're going to see this emergent ecology of self-steering and co-steering systems with the rise of DAOs, and I think we should be looking forward to it, but we should be very mindful of it. And so my sort of final slide here is to talk about what really is an autonomous system in a social and economic system sense, even when it contains a technological system. And in this case, my yellow and pink are my technological system. I've got sort of we'll say it's a smart contract that allows some possible interaction patterns, some mechanisms, and maybe that contract has embedded in it some algorithmic state feedback. So as the state of the contract changes, the what you can do or the impact of doing something changes. And we can see that our population, our community is being given some can-dos by this. So I can rage quit. Maybe I will, maybe I won't. It's up to me. But I know what will happen if I do it. The actually does and can do are closely related, but inherently different. Can do is infrastructure, actually does is behavior. And so we start to have these two feedback loops, which is what we often talk about, but really truly having an adaptive system here requires us to participate in the decisions about adapting the yellow and pink box here, right? Adapting the rules, adapting the feedback systems so that they can continue to meet our needs. If our goals change as a community, our steering system needs to change with those goals, and ultimately the informed participants steer the system in the direction they want it to go, which basically leads us with, that's our adaptive maintenance. So we're engineering large-scale infrastructure systems for social and economic properties, and they can't be perfect, but they can be adaptive. And that's the reason why we have to pay so much attention to what governance is. It also means we need to pay attention to what our systems are, how they interact with each other, and come to a world where we can actually control or arguably be our own infrastructure.